From a man running by himself on the beach to someone else failing to wear a mask. These are just some of the rules that law enforcement has been tasked with enforcing in recent weeks during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've gotten a lot of things right, but we've gotten some things wrong. Now is the time to learn about rules versus laws. Welcome to SAFETAC Training. My name is Travis Yates, and we have an exciting guest today to teach us on a topic that is extremely timely. Before we get going, our two sponsors for today's training video is Liberty University. Check out in the link section how you can get a 25% discount to go to school there. And of course, our longtime sponsor, Law Officer Magazine, lawofficer.com. We want to thank them for helping us promote this training. But today's training is as timely as it ever gets. And in case you're watching this months down the road, let me tell you exactly what's going on around the world. We're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're about 6 weeks into many of the stay-at-home orders, many of the rules and the regulations that states and counties and cities have imposed on the public. And guess who they are using to impose those rules? Law enforcement. And quite frankly, law enforcement was not ready, was not prepared for that issue. Now, that's a leadership issue. Stacy and Ettel and I go back a long ways on the Courageous Leadership Tour and our seminars and the book that's out. So that's for another video. But first, I want to welcome you, Stacy, Ettel, SAFETAC Training, Courageous Leadership Institute, all bunch of stuff that you're doing, sir. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
What's up, Travis, man? Thank you so much for having me. And obviously this issue is such a big issue, but there's so many other things going on. So I appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with me.
Man, I can't think of a better time for this. And let me tell our audience, I first heard of this class with you. You came to one of our seminars, and if those of you who don't know, Stacy team teaches with me with the Courageous Leadership Institute. We do our leadership seminar. Stacy is a huge component of that. He brings some passion that you've got to have. So if you want to check out what we do there together, we'll put that in the link section. But Stacy had included this in one of the seminars. It was a class called Rules versus Laws. And I got to be honest with you, this is why I know law enforcement is behind on this. I mean, I've been in law enforcement for 27 years, Lord willing, it'll be 28 next month. And I first heard the class and I was like, come on, what is this about? Really? Rules versus laws? First off, Stacy, there's no sexy to that. I mean, that just seems like a boring class. But I heard the class and I thought, man, there's something to that. And now law enforcement is in the middle of rules versus laws, and it is apparent around the world we don't know the difference. And so I thought it would be pretty cool to bring Stacy in. And of course, she's not going to be able to give the entire class. We'll give you details down below on how to get that class. But Stacy, first tell us your background and how you got involved and got so passionate about law enforcement rules versus laws.
You know, when I started police work in Gainesville, Florida, at the University of Florida back in 1993, I was a young officer, and they used to throw us in the football stands during the big games. And they'd have us stand in the stands, and they'd be like, hey, certain rules apply to the stands. Like, for instance, there's a bleacher. You pay for your ticket. You go stand in your bleacher area. Well, you have your seat that you're assigned to. But don't step off the concrete and step up on that bleacher, or you're violating the rule. So they'd say, hey, too many people standing on their bleachers. Go over there and tell those people to get off those bleachers. And I was a young cop, and I'd go over there and go, hey, young fraternity guy, you can't be standing on that bleacher. And the alcohol would talk from the other person, and they'd be like, let's pay for this seat. I'd be like, listen, you don't get off that bleacher, I'm going to take you out of here. And they'd be like, you can't take me out of here for standing on a bleacher. I'd say, shoop, and I'd drag them out of it. And I thought, that's just the way it works. I didn't know. Right? And then move forward a couple of years, and life kind of keeps moving forward, and I get promoted, and now I'm a sergeant over an area, then a lieutenant on the west side or the east stands, and time's kind of going along. And then I was in charge of special events, and we had this thing called Don't Tase Me, Bro. And you remember the
Well, I think unless you're like 20 years or younger, everybody knows the incident, but they don't know you were intimately involved in that.
Correct. I was the I was the commander of special events, and I had set that event up. We had a sergeant, some officers working that event. And again, another issue involving rules. And the college.
Now, just for the background, Stacey, this was a John Kerry presidential nomination event. He was running for president, right?
No, he had lost the presidency. And
Okay.
he was speaking, losing the presidency. And an individual stood up to start talking, and he started kind of getting belligerent, and they went to interrupt him. Instead of the organization dealing with it or shutting off mics, they asked law enforcement to intercede.
Yep.
Well, it turned into what we've all seen as "Don't Tase Me, Bro," and the college panicked. And they had, a month later after this event, they had Dr. Jack Kevorkian coming in to speak. Well, they were panicking.
Death.
Yes,
Dr. Death.
Because you have.
First, I'll hold up, Stacey. I don't want to interrupt you, but everybody that's been to our classes knows I do this to him all the time. Your life is crazy, man. You go from John Kerry, "Don't Tase Me, Bro," Dr. Death, to you name the sports athlete. You're crazy, man. You're crazy. We want to live through you.
It's insane, man. And, you know, so Terry Schiavo is in a hospital in Tampa and is refusing to be fed on the old feeding tube issue. Remember the feeding tube issue involving Terry Schiavo? And then you've got Dr. Death, and all this stuff is happening around the John Kerry "Don't Tase Me, Bro," and the college is like, wait a minute. We've got to figure out how not to let "Don't Tase Me, Bro" happen again. So I was assigned to go to the college administrators and teach them about a use of force continuum and how that works. We're talking civilian staff and attorneys. And I'm going to teach them how to do that. And along that conversation, I'm going to talk to them about changing the approach of putting law enforcement in a position to enforce rules.
Yep.
So I explained how we can change it into a tiered approach. And so I developed this tiered system, developed a thing called rule versus laws, and went around the country teaching mostly venues and facilities, not agencies at the time.
Because who knew we would need it? I mean, who knew, right?
Of course.
We're law enforcement. We enforce laws. Who knew we'd be running around the country at churches and transit buses and saying, "Hey, wear your mask or you're out of here"? Who knew that? It's a big, gigantic, worldwide college football game. Get off the bleachers.
You can't stand on the bleacher.
Right.
You pay, by the way. Exactly. So it just took off and became this big deal. And I started teaching it, and agencies started reaching out and asking about some guidelines on this tiered system. And I implemented using civilian contacts to try to change the way they handle these things before they used us. And that's what I did. I developed a tiered system. And then you see stuff like United Airlines and the way that those things happen, and that exploded, and school resource deputies, and then high school and sports levels events. And then you started talking about homeowners associations. You know, when I left one job and went to another, I started dealing with HOAs, things I didn't deal with in a college environment. And so they've got rules, and it's like, hey, you can't fly your flag. Well, tell the police to go over there and tell them they can't fly their flag. It's not our job. That's a rule. And that's how this started rolling.
Well, let me back up, because I want to make sure our audience understands the whole backdrop of this. You talked about the airline, and that was when I think they kicked a passenger off the airline, so they called the law enforcement to come get off the airline, right? And so law enforcement gets in a big down, knockout, drag-out fight on the airline. The video goes viral. Everybody loses their minds. You can go back to the Starbucks incident, which there was a crime committed. We're going to get into how a rule can convert into a crime. But the guy refused to leave a private business, right? And so there are times when we do get involved, but so many of these instances, and you're right. So let's talk about, Stacey, you got your start with big-time college football, SEC, right? 100,000 people at the stadium. Let's talk about how law enforcement changed their approach. And I think most people that's been to a major sporting event in recent years is going to know what you're about to say. How did you change your approach when someone was actually breaking a rule versus a law?
So what we utilize, we use this T-search security event staff type personnel that you see out there that already are there. They're already working, and they're kind of a primary enforcement for us. And we said, wait a minute, organizations, facilities, high school staff, administration, event staff personnel. When there's an issue brought to law enforcement, don't have me walk down there. It's your venue, it's your facility, it's your organization, it's your HOA. You go and deal with it. Yep. So let's use the bleacher thing again. Send the young T-shirt guy down there. Sir, you can't stand on the bleachers. The guy goes, hey man, get out of here. So the T-shirt guy walks back up and says, he said for me to leave. Well, we're not in a rush. It's not like it's dangerous. So what do? Hey, you go get your supervisor of your T-shirt security and have them go down there with you. Now you have a second level, because we could have a communication, could have an age issue, could have a lack of respect. So let's send a civilian supervisor down there. So they go down there. Sir, you need to get off the bleachers. I'm not getting off the bleachers. If you don't get off the bleachers, I'm going to have to ask law enforcement to remove you from the stadium. I have the authority to tell you would be trespassing now.
Now it converts into a crime.
That's
how it converts into a crime. You're hard pressed, and what we've seen in recent weeks is we're going immediately to convert into crime, and we're not using that step process, which is why we're looking like complete fools in the scenario. And by the way, these officers are meaning well. They don't know. They're being told by mayors and governors and police chiefs, go down here and do this without any guidance whatsoever. And what you're saying, Stacy, is there's no excuse. We've been doing this way in these private events for years. Everybody that's been to a concert knows exactly what I'm talking about. Somebody gets unruly in a concert, you don't see law enforcement coming down there. You see T-shirt security. If it goes downhill from there, it converts to a criminal offense. Then they're getting law enforcement involved.
You look at United Airlines, and I've studied this story a lot. United Airlines has a man who flew on a plane to a location. He then stayed on that plane waiting for the next flight. While he's sitting on the plane, he was randomly drawn to remove him from his seat to place somebody else there that they needed. Another pilot, I don't know who it was. And they said, you can't be here. He's like, wait a minute, I was on here. They didn't know he was a physician and all this. He's like, no, I've been here. And they're like, too bad. The back of your ticket says that. So they tell him you need to leave. He doesn't leave. Law enforcement doesn't walk up and say, hey, sir, United Airlines has requested you leave. I'm sorry for the situation. They're going to try to make it right. But you're now trespassing. If you do not follow the guidelines, I'm going to have to arrest you for trespassing after warning. Not for his sake, so that everybody else sees this.
Yep.
Everybody else around sees it and knows exactly why at some point they had to go hands on him. But here's the sad part of that. What happens when we don't do that right is 2 of those individuals lost their job. 1 supervisor got suspended. It's destructive to their careers because now it's all over the internet and it destroys them. And Travis, we all know how that is.
Yeah, let me transition what you just said, because the big news right now, once again, you may be watching this days or months down the road, but the big news right now is Kentucky State Police. They go to a church on Easter Sunday. This is the day after, it's being recorded the day after Easter. And they go to the church on Easter Sunday and they put notices on cars. Now there's a big, wide backstory to this that the media is not going to tell you. As Stacy and I often say in our seminars, they're in no business to tell you the truth. They tell you a half-truth, which is a lie, because it's about emotion. If they leave part of the story out, they get people ramped up. So the news hits, the Twitter trolls start going, and it's the Christian persecution. The police are arresting people at church on Easter Sunday. Okay, take a step back. Here's what actually happened. This one pastor in Kentucky, there's always one. If we don't learn anything law enforcement, there's always one, which is why it's important we understand rules versus laws. 99 people on the bus in Philadelphia may follow the rules, but there's always going to be one. How are you going to deal with the one? We don't have a problem with people that have common sense to go, oh, okay, it makes sense that this is the rules and I'm going to follow the rules. 99% of the people follow the rules. I may be being generous there, Stacy, but 99% of the people follow the rules. But we train for the 1%, and the 1% will always be on video, and that's how the public is perceiving law enforcement. So we've got to get this right. So this one pastor has kind of fought the governor. There's an emergency order in all 50 states. The governor said, hey, no large gatherings. Well, this one pastor, just one church, Billet County, Kentucky, says, no, it's our right to assemble. We're going to do it. That's hope for a whole other show. I did church at home. I'm sure you did too. I think it's completely irresponsible for them to be that hard-headed. We're not living in the Middle East. You're not going to get your head cut off going to church. I think it's a common sense request, but with what's going on today. But that's for a whole other show. But there's always one, and so they assemble. He's filed a lawsuit this week to try to assemble. I don't know what the judge has said with that. So on Easter Sunday morning, I talked to the Kentucky State Police yesterday, something the media, by the way, did not do, so they wrote all their stories. I talked to the Kentucky State Police. They said, hey, listen, we got a ton of calls on Easter Sunday, different events going on of too many crowds. So we responded to all of them. Once again, that's what law enforcement does. We respond to calls. So it wasn't the state police running around checking churches like this, like these Gestapo, like people are trying to tell us. No, they got a call, 911 call you got to go to. They said almost every call we went to, we didn't find an issue. We go to this one call, this one church, and we found a couple dozen cars, maybe 1 to 2 dozen cars in the parking lot. So they had a notice. It was an order. They didn't make contact with anybody in the church. They didn't write any tickets. They didn't make any arrests. They put a notice on the cars. Well, we're going to get to that in a minute, but what you talked about is very important earlier. Why is law enforcement the initial entity making contact with what is essentially a civil order? That's what the flyer basically said. There was a little problem with the flyer. I'll get to that in a minute. The flyer started off, there's probably 150 words on the flyer, Stacy. 140 words were perfect. It was, listen, this is a bad situation. There's an emergency order in the state of Kentucky. COVID-19 can kill you. It can affect your lungs. This is a big deal. So the health department is requesting that we notify people who's out and about, just so in case something happens. We care for you. I mean, it all made sense. Now, people got upset that, oh, how dare that they put notices on the cars and write our tag numbers down. Let me help all the Twitter people out there. Anybody can do that, Stacy, right? Any parking lot you park in, anybody can take your photograph. They can write your tag down. They can send it to whoever they want. They can put a flyer on your car. But when law enforcement does it, I think this is why it's important. You talked about a civil entity, a private entity making the initial contact, Stacy, until a crime happens. When law enforcement does it, it ramps it up. I can guarantee you if Jehovah's Witnesses walked on that church parking lot and put flyers on the car, nobody cares. But law enforcement is seen in that parking lot. It gives an impression that does not help us. So those poor state troopers, they had no intention to arrest anybody. They were just advising people. Hey, this is kind of it didn't say this. You're kind of stupid for doing this. This is how dangerous this is. And that's what I think a lot of these rules need to be for. Like you talked about with the game, it's an educational thing. Hey, you can't get on the bleachers because of this. You can't do this because we need to educate people. And I think they did the right thing. But at the very bottom of the flyer, and I guarantee you the police did not write this flyer. This is something important for the leadership into this, Stacy, is quit doing the bidding for your politicians, because it's not them that's going to get the hate. It's you. Now, if a politician says, go put these flyers on cars, at the very bottom it goes, and if you don't do this, you're subject to prosecution. Guess who they're going to blame for that? You. You're the one that did it. So we're going to have to get some, leadership's going to have to stand up here and go, this is ridiculous. Is it technically probably a crime to violate an emergency order under an emergency situation? Yeah, just kind of like it's technically to not leave your seat in the airline industry, but there's a step process that happens before it's a crime. Now, here's the unfortunate part. The state police correctly did the step process. They weren't there to prosecute. They were there to educate, and they were there to warn. But the problem I see with it is the police should not be involved in these issues, Stacy. I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Travis. And you look at the physical aspect of laying a flyer that was pre-printed by some entity on a windshield of a car. And the fact that you've taken a law enforcement officer that you're paying money on off-duty detail, if that's what they were doing, to place this flyer up there shows an enforcement level right out of the gate. I'm putting it on the flyer. I'm telling you aren't supposed to be here. That's my hands putting that on there. If you separate them, they're not even around. They have nothing to do with it. And some citizen assigned by the organization is walking around putting flyers out, whoever that is, the city, the county, whatever.
Well, I can tell you that the flyer said they were going to be reported to the health department. So it should be the health department involved in that.
Perfect. Whoever it is, whatever entity it is, law enforcement should only be brought in when they say, for instance, a fire marshal comes in and says, hey, you have too many people in this church. You must now evacuate this church, right? That's a rule issue initially. And the fire department says, we're not evacuating. We have the right to assemble. We're not evacuating. If you don't evacuate and reduce your numbers, I'm going to call law enforcement in to have to deal with this, right? So now they're giving them a warning. Yeah. And they say, we're still not disassembling. Now it changes to a legal issue versus a rule issue, right? Yep. So that's how we mix these. But that fire department is a separate entity from the enforcement side. I've always said this before, and nobody ever believed me when I said it to civilians. The most powerful person in this country is not a president. It's not a judge. It is that single one police officer floating around out there doing their job. Why? Because they have the ability at any time to take away your civil rights.
Yep. Legally
or illegally. They can do that. And so what we're doing is civilians know they have a lot of power, and we're trying to use their badge, their car, and their uniform to show a presence to get you to change your mind on a rule. A rule now. It's the same. I think about this all the time, Travis, about schools, right? We hire school resource deputies or officers, and they are assigned to the school. The school has you got to keep your pants pulled up, right? You can't wear a hat, whatever the rules are, right? And when they don't, instead of them dealing with it, they ask the police to come deal with it. And what happens? The kid gets
we
to be a
see
smart.
it. Yeah.
They clash.
Think about all the viral videos in recent months. Almost everyone deals with this very issue. Rule versus law. And, let me take people back to the other viral video from the weekend is the Philadelphia Transit. I think it's called SEPTA, S-E-P-T-A. It's the transit bus system there in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And they have, they had a rule, and the rule made sense. They had 3 employees die in recent weeks from COVID-19. So with the union and the bosses there, they made a rule that said, hey, every rider needs to wear a mask. We're not going to shut the bus system down because it's important. But if you're going to ride, you need to wear a mask. They communicate to the public, but then there's that one. And sure enough, there's that one. So the bus driver called law enforcement. First off, it's a public transit. It's obviously an entity away from law enforcement. I guess you could say the bus driver was that first level of say, hey, get off this bus, because she did ask him to get off the bus. But law enforcement comes in, and this is a whole other topic here, because they came in, they asked him several times to put a mask on. He said no, right? I liked what Senator Ted Cruz said. He said, well, wouldn't it have been just easier to give him a mask? It shows you how out of touch politicians are, Stacey. Does anyone really believe that when the guy refuses to follow any commands or anything whatsoever, that he's going to put a mask on? Of course he'd put a mask on if he would put a mask on, but that's why we're in this situation. He's not going to put a mask on. Well, Stacey, with that story in Philadelphia in mind of going on the transit bus, you as a law enforcement officer, what would you have done in response to that?
Well, if you back up for just a minute and look at it, we've all responded to traffic crashes involving regional transit buses. And by the time we get there in our police cars, it always seems like there's a supervisor in charge of the buses who shows up and beats us there, or is already there or shows up right afterwards. So what I'm thinking is, if they had a system in place, the bus driver would make a request. The person didn't follow the guidelines or the rules, so what would they do next? He would pull over, stop the bus, and call for a supervisor to come to the scene. Now remember, sometimes people don't follow rules because they just aren't going to follow them.
Yep.
And they're not going to follow the bus driver, the supervisor, or the police. Sometimes they don't follow them because the way it's delivered. So sometimes there's a personality conflict. So maybe the bus driver doesn't get compliance, but the bus supervisor does. So he shows up and he requests. Now we have 2 different personalities trying to work through it. Then when that person doesn't get compliance, they make some type of a statement like, hey, if you don't put the mask on, we'll have to remove you from the bus. If you don't leave the bus, we'll call law enforcement. So then I would arrive as a law enforcement officer. When I got there, I would ask how they'd communicated, who had communicated, and what steps had been taken. Bus driver, supervisor. Then I would request, hey, there's some guidelines out there. If you don't mind putting it on, would you please put it on? I'm not putting it on. Now, maybe that person doesn't like my personality. Maybe there's another officer who's coming to back me up because it's a disturbance, right? So maybe I'm not in a rush, right? It's not a big deal. So I would allow the second officer to do that. Here's why. 1, the driver. 2, the supervisor. 3, me. And 4, my backup officer all made the same request. Then the statements were made about trespassing now that we've transitioned and had the bus drivers say that. Everybody else on the bus has heard 4 steps.
And the person making the decision on trespassing is the private entity, the bus driver, not law enforcement. And then that places us in the law enforcement role like any other trespassing call.
That is correct. It's no different than somebody who had a trespass from Walmart shows up, and guess what happens? They're asked to leave again, and they're contacted. But remember, a lot of times we do stuff to protect ourselves. Sometimes we do it to educate others on our steps. Everybody else on that bus heard 4 different people make this request. Yep. That's a step or a tiered system.
Yeah, and I think that the missing component after this, and I hate to put this on the line officers, but this is a leadership issue. It happened in Kentucky as well. Why are we letting people that don't know anything about that incident reporting on that incident? As we talk about in our Courageous Leadership Seminar, Stacey, and in our book, The Courageous Police Leader, we'll put all the links down below. We need to be our own voice. We need to be our own media. There's no reason the Kentucky State Police had to have known that when they went to a church parking lot after all of the buildup that week to placard those cars, which was in their right, that this would be a big deal to some, because there's just some people that are looking for scandal, looking for the conspiracy theory. And why did they not put the message out? what they did, why they did. They had no intention to prosecute. This is a safety issue for all citizens, because what everybody's missing here, and we're just not doing that. Even as last night, there was not an official response from the Kentucky State Police. In fact, I think Lawster.com was the first full article that told the whole story on that. And, you know, you just can't rely on the major media outlets to do that. And it's really unfortunate. And I was engaging with a few of these folks on Twitter, trying to calm them down. Of course, there's no calming people down. The percentage of people that's had their mind changed on Twitter is 0%. But this is what they would say to me. Okay, you're saying most law enforcement, because what I told them, I said, hey, law enforcement's not out here, you know, trying to take people's rights away. If they were, there wouldn't be 20 stories this last week. There'd be 2,000 stories, because we're encountering millions of people a day, you know, and for the most part, we're doing a good job. It only takes one. And what their response to me always is, okay, then where are those stories? Where are the stories on law enforcement that are abiding by the rules, abiding by the rights? Well, people don't understand this. The media is not going to tell those stories. There's no way the media was going to tell the accurate story in Kentucky or Philadelphia, because that doesn't sell news. It doesn't make them money. And we need to quit setting back thinking that by giving an interview to a news media outlet, the truth's going to come out. And so we're not even close to being there. And that's why I think our job security is fine when we do the leadership stuff, Stacey, because it's so horrific. But here's what bothers me. If you go to Chick-fil-A and you're treated horribly, I can't imagine that, but let's say it happens. You're not mad at the clerk. You're mad at the company. You're mad at the supervisor, because usually supervisor intervenes. But when a street cop, out of the 800,000 street cops, get involved in something, the hate is going to the street cop, because our leadership is so horrific in those situations, and we're not defending those officers. And that's what bothers me. And that's why when it comes to rules versus laws, we have to get it right. And I love the idea of all these entities ought to have a plan in place. And here's who else who ought to have a plan in place. When that officer shows up on that Philadelphia bus, they ought to have a policy where they go, okay, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Oh, you didn't do that? Well, we're not going to intervene until you do all these steps. Bye, right? And that way we're holding the entity responsible. Because do you think the Philadelphia bus is going to take the heat? Heck no. In fact, this is what they did, and we're used to this all the time, right? It happened in Starbucks. They had a rule. You couldn't ride without a mask. Well, after this happened, guess what they did? You know what they did. What'd they do?
Change the rule.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we're so sorry. Now you can ride the bus without a mask. We're so sorry this happened. So the entities are not going to defend law enforcement, so we've got to hold them accountable. And so we're going to follow this training video up, Stacey, with some step-by-step guidelines for law enforcement and entities, and you'll be a part of that. I can't thank you enough, because you're literally the world's expert in this area, and we need it now more than ever. Now, here's what we don't want to happen, and this is for all you leaders out there in law enforcement and the private industry, because this is responsible for you. We don't want to get past this pandemic, because we will be past this pandemic shortly, and then go, well, that's not going to happen again. We don't need to implement policies. We don't need to implement rules. Stop it. Just stop it. It doesn't matter where you are or what's going on. Law enforcement from time to time is going to be asked to enforce rules, whether it's probably not going to be on this wide of a scale, but it's going to be something. It's going to be, hey, you can't be in the park, or this is a private event. You got to leave, or you're in your wrong movie seat, or a school kid is violating a school rule. And every year there's videos that come out of us dragging a kid out of their chair or getting into it with somebody. And Philadelphia showed it. They got into a physical altercation with that guy and apparently had no reason to arrest him because they let him go, which violates every rule in my book in law enforcement. If you're putting hands on somebody, there better be a crime to take them to jail for.
That's correct. You're exactly right, Travis. And I look at it from a bunch of different perspectives. And one of it is, go back to what you said about being our own media, right? Part of the classes, we teach you to, in advance, tell people we have a tiered system in place. We have a working relationship with all these different entities. And if you have good relations, and a lot of us do in agencies with the media, we go out and talk to the media and we tell them, hey, look, we've implemented a tiered system in our agency. These individual entities are going to understand our tiered approach to dealing with these things so that we don't hang our law enforcement officers up based on a rule concern, and
right.
Work with them, the media, your social media, your PIOs, as well as your officers from a training perspective, and set it all out there so everybody can see it. We don't have a reason to hide it. Sell it to everybody. Let them all know.
Stacey, Ettel, rules versus laws. Man, if you have not seen this class, you've not had this information, you've got to reach out to us. You can reach out to us at safetac.org. We'll put all of the links in the description of this video. Thank you for joining us, Stacy. Thank you so much. Be safe there in the great state of Florida. Give your wife my best and all of your family. And thank you so much for being on today.
You too, Travis. Take care of the family and look forward to seeing you again.
Stacy Ettel, thank you, sir. And thank you for joining us here at SAFETAC Training.